Well, greetings to everyone. Welcome to Expanding Perceptions. I'm really delighted today to be talking to an amazing gentleman, Dr. Eben Alexander. Dr. Alexander has been a neurosurgeon and associate professor at Harvard University. He's performed over 4,000 neurosurgeries, has published over 150 articles and chapters in peer-reviewed publications. He's a graduate of University of North Carolina, received his medical degree from Duke University. What he's best known these days, though, is this remarkable experience he had back in 2008, in which he, a very traumatic but amazing experience of a near-death experience, which permanently altered his views of consciousness and his views of his place in the world. Now, he detailed these experiences in his best-selling books, Proof of Heaven and The Map of Heaven, that were on the New York Times bestseller list for many weeks. His latest book is Living in a Mindful Universe, co-authored with Kara Newell. He's been on such programs as Larry King Live, Oprah, New Thinking Aloud with Jeffrey Mishlove, and today I got them all to myself. So, Eben, thanks so much for talking to me today, my friend.
Well, Paul, it's great to be with you. Thanks so much for having me on.
Yeah, well, I'm really excited about what we're going to talk about. Now, you have told this story 4 billion times, I know. So I'm just going to ask you for an abbreviated, experiences. What really changed you back going from someone who kind of knelt at the altar, metaphorically, of reductionist materialism as far as how the brain operates, into someone who has a different perspective on the brain as a filter of consciousness rather than the complete source of that. Can you take us back to that 2008 experience?
Yes, absolutely. I think important to point out, as you've hinted, I'd spent the first 54 years of my life honing a very conventional scientific worldview. Reductive materialism or physicalism, the notion that only the physical world exists, and that things like thoughts, emotions, ideas, beliefs have no basis in reality. In fact, that materialist thinking is so kind of so far off base that they assume that it's all chemical reactions, electron fluxes, and so nobody has free will at all, which is ridiculous from my point of view. That was one of the greatest lessons of my journey. Well, in November of 2008, I had a major wake-up call, and it came in the form of gram-negative bacterial meningoencephalitis. It drove me into coma within 3 hours or so. My doctors estimated when I first got to the ER, deep in coma and seizing, that I had a 10% chance of survival. But that number went down over 7 days as I was on a ventilator on 3 powerful intravenous antibiotics. And by the end of that 7 days, they estimated 2% chance of survival, no chance of recovery. And that's why they recommended stopping the antibiotics. And it was a few hours later, I came back to this world. And in many ways, the doctors were right. Even though I came back initially, it was very frightening for my family because my brain was so wrecked. But what I knew when I came back was this extraordinary journey I had been on. And that's, of course, what I describe in Proof of Heaven. One of the reasons it's so important to the medical and scientific community is not only the medical details that I shared in Proof of Heaven, but the case report on my medical records written by 3 physicians not involved in my care. And that case report was in the Journal of Nervous and Mental Diseases in September 2018 by Dr. Serbi Khanna and Lauren Moore and Bruce Grayson. And that case report goes even further than I did in Proof of Heaven, documenting how my brain was in no shape to harbor any kind of dream or hallucination. I mean, all 8 lobes of my brain were involved in a horrifically deadly and lethal version of E. coli meningoencephalitis. And the very fact that I could even come back was a shock to my doctors. But over 2 months, I then had a full recovery, which was a shock to everyone. And it's really the essence of the journey, though, that I should summarize for your listeners. One important difference of my NDE compared to many NDEs you'll hear about is my amnesia, that I had no memory of Eben Alexander's life. I had no knowledge of Earth, this universe, humanity, language, words. Every bit of it was gone. I had a real empty slate. And initially, of course, I explained all that because I thought, well, my neocortex was horribly damaged. We know that much. So maybe that's where all the memories went away, but how come they came back even more fully in the 2 months after coma? That we go into that detail about all of this in our third book, Living in a Mindful Universe, because memories are not even stored in the brain. That's one of the biggest shocks that my story reveals, as do many other lines of evidence. Now, the journey itself, what I did know when I woke up in that ICU bed and didn't even recognize my sons, my sisters, my mother at the bedside, because my brain was still so fried, but I knew where I'd been. And that experience was so burned into my memory. I remember it today as if it happened yesterday. Just shocking how crisp and stable and ultra real and detailed those memories are. My journey started in what I call the earthworm's eye view, very primitive course on a responsive realm. I was rescued from that by a slowly spinning clear white light. It had the appearance of kind of broken glass, came with a musical melody that was very important in conjuring that portal back up later in the journey. But it led up into this brilliant, ultra real gateway valley. And that's one of the toughest things to explain to people is that, you know, many people think an NDE is murky and dreamlike. Well, this is murky and dreamlike. This material existence, that realm is sharp, crystal clear, absolutely filled with meaning, rich with kind of a relationship with the universe and kind of our soul story writ large. And that's what I was experiencing in that Gateway Valley. It had many Earth-like features, but I often describe it as being like Plato's world of ideals, but for the soul on a journey. That's why in that meadow with all of its lush plant life and flowers and blossoms on trees and buds blooming and all that kind of thing, there was no sign of any death or decay. It was a rich world of just beauty and love, comfort, and seemed like a spiritual home. It may sound foreign to people by description, but as many near-death experiences will tell you, when you're in that incredible zone, it's our home. It's where we really belong. Now, that's not to take away from the fact that I have come to realize, as have many other NDEers, that we get the work done here. You know, it's almost like breathing, you know, you're in and out, the kind of incarnation in this body, and then between lives, planning next incarnations, and then coming back in to do it again, but better in a process of refinement. So anyway, in this Gateway Valley, I was a speck of awareness on a butterfly wing. There were millions of other butterflies looping and spiraling in these vast formations. There were thousands of beings dancing in this meadow down below, very simple but colorful garb. And all the joy and merriment was being fueled because up above were these swooping orbs of angelic choirs leaving kind of sparkly golden dust trails against the blue-black velvety sky, and pure color emanating from the clouds and from the scene itself. I mean, it was just an incredible light that's in many ways indescribable. The best part was I wasn't alone on the butterfly wing. I had a beautiful spiritual companion who I referred to in my early writings as my guardian angel. And her message to me, which was repeated every time I came up through this level on my way to the core realm: you are deeply loved and cherished forever. You have nothing to fear. You are deeply cared for. And I put it in the book, Proof of Heaven. I also included, you can do no wrong. I wish I had explained that much better in the book, because people tend to misunderstand it. They don't get how powerful the ambience of love and connection and oneness and shared purpose that is the dominant feature of life reviews and of that kind of realm. And that's what I knew at the time. So you can do no wrong to me meant we are on a pathway of free will. And that free will, the straightest and most beautiful pathway forward towards oneness with the divine, is through this kind of acceptance of oneness and this understanding of how we're all in this together. We should take care of each other. The golden rule, you know, treat others as you would like to be treated, is written into the very fabric of the universe through the life review that's been described for more than 2,400 years by millions and millions of near-death experiencers and similar mystics, prophets who have shared in glimpsing the non-material realms. Well, it turns out that was only the kind of a gateway, as I said. That valley led to something else, and the something else had to do with the portal that opened up from the music of those angelic choirs. And it brought yet another portal, just like the one that had ushered me up from the earthworm's eye view. And this one took me up into the core realm. And in that process, I remember seeing all of four-dimensional space-time collapsing down, all of that spiritual realm that I'd been through in the Gateway Valley with a different causal chain, what I call deep time. Very important to understand that what we see as earth time, we think is so fundamental, is not. It's really part of the stage setting on which this drama can unfold. And it's important from that deeper perspective of deep time. And that's why things like life reviews can happen. And many people will describe a life review not as just kind of these rich memories, but reliving the experience. And not only that, you relive it often from the perspective of others around you who are affected by your thoughts and actions. So that's why we often say that golden rule is right there in the life review. Because if you mistreat others, you have to be on the receiving end of that in your life review. And it kind of gently goads us towards that love and kindness and compassion and mercy that is present in that deity, that kind of God force that is so reassuring to NDEers when they come back to this world. And so that was a tremendous part of the lesson of the journey. In the core realm, that's where this all led. And it was a complete resolution of all the dualisms, good, bad, light, dark, hate, love, etc. Every bit of that comes together into this brilliant and beautiful oneness and identity. And for me, it was a demonstration that the very source of our conscious awareness, as revealed through these profound journeys, the very source of that is that God force. So just as many religions teach, many prophets have taught that God, that kingdom of God lies within us. That's how it was put, for example, in Christian teachings. Jesus of Nazareth was a great teacher of much of this, but I came back realizing that all the great faiths that focus on a loving, merciful God are really on the same pathway. And I've had friends, other NDEers who have been on profound journeys, had profound healing, like Anita Morjani and her healing from lymphoma, Dr. Mary C. Neal, who healed from an over 30-minute warm water drowning. And what these examples show us, just like the case report made clear about my case, is that there is a deep spiritual component to healing. And that's where I think all of this gets to be much more exciting and useful for each and every soul that hears of these kind of journeys. And so I cycled through those realms multiple times, taught many things in that core realm. The core realm was as close to a spiritual home as you could be, and yet it's as far from any describability from our earthly language as you could be, that pure oneness with the divine. That's why Karen and I, instead of just talking about this in our book, Living in a Mindful Universe, we shared meditative techniques because that's important. People can read about all this till the cows come home, and certainly reading and learning about NDEs helps people. But ultimately, going within is the key to the kingdom. And that's why we encourage people to meditate, centering prayer, all the various modes of going within to basically escape the shackles of that ego mind, the little voice in our head, which is not our consciousness. But it's that deep awareness that we're trying to cultivate and a connection with something bigger. So it's been an extraordinary journey, and I've spent the last 13 years working with other scientists, experiencers, and especially with my life partner, Karen Newell, the co-founder of Sacred Acoustics, to help bring these kind of techniques and ideas to the world in a process of healing.
As I'm listening to your story, I'm also struck by it's a cliche term, but paradigm shift occurred for you. And for myself, it kind of had to be a personal experience to kind of, because I'm a psychology guy, I'm a brain guy, it had to be something personal to kind of go, I wonder. And now you've had this incredible paradigm shift. Before this happened, what was your attitude toward certainly these kind of experiences, which being a neurosurgeon, I'm sure you've had to have heard some of these. Was it an automatic? Oh, well, yeah, that's just prefrontal cortex shut off and blah blah blah. Here, your hippocampus is encoding, so blah blah blah. Was that how you originally looked at that?
Well, it's a wonderful question because it brings up some of the more personal and powerful details to my life, and specifically, that involves my father. I was adopted at the age of 4 months into a very loving family, and my adoptive father was a globally renowned neurosurgeon. He was very scientific, knew a lot about cosmology and physics, and he was the chairman of a training program, and literally spoke around the world about his findings. But he always had a strong faith in God. His own father in Eastern Tennessee had been a general surgeon, brought him up during the Depression. And, my dad was a combat surgeon in the Second World War. In fact, I still have his little pocket Bible that he took with him to New Guinea, the Philippines, and on into Tokyo back in the mid 40s during his 2+ year stint in the Army Air Force as a combat surgeon. And he came back relatively unscathed. And I think that was because of his very strong belief in a loving personal God and the power of prayer. I know he used that all the time in his medical practice. And he believed that any real healing was really accomplished through God and through the power of prayer, and that he simply served as a surgeon to help those things occur. Now, I grew up in the 60s and 70s, and like many in that generation, I always knew science is the pathway to truth. I wanted to believe what I heard in my Methodist church growing up, but I was always following science for the truth. I was aware of Big Bang cosmology way back in my teen years, and have followed physics, cosmology, quantum physics, et cetera, ever since. Now, I didn't realize the true depth of the mystery of the measurement paradox in quantum physics. I just thought, like so many who study quantum physics, that you don't want to go there to the depths of the experiments because they reveal some very unsettling facts about the nature of reality. So for many years, I could kind of let that go, and I just focused on the brain creates consciousness. That's what I'd been taught. I wanted to believe in an afterlife of some sort, but I couldn't understand how it could happen, how conscious awareness could survive the death of the brain and body. And I guess that's why I had such a profound experience in November 2008. I think it's also important to point out that, again, part of my adoption story, I'd quit looking for my birth mother back in my 20s. Just accepted she wasn't looking for me, I could forget about it. I never thought my birth parents had gotten together. Then in the year 2000, when I was 47 years old, my son, doing a school project, was in family genealogy, and he said, "Dad, we need to find out more about your birth family." So I wrote a letter to the children's home. This is all story told in Proof of Heaven. And I got an unexpected answer back while driving through a blizzard in February of 2000. And that was that my birth parents had gotten married. I heard that from a social worker in a 2-minute phone call while I was taking my older son skiing up in New Hampshire, or up in Maine, wherever it was, driving through the blizzard. And that's when, boy, did it hit me hard, that because they got married, they had 3 children, but the youngest daughter had died 2 years earlier. That would have been 1998. And the social worker interpreted all this as they were still grieving her loss, so it was not a good time to come back in their lives. That was not the truth, but that's how, the North Carolina laws were very strict to forbid people from reuniting with birth parents, et cetera. And that was in full force. And that sent me into a dark night of the soul. I didn't realize it, but in 2000, for 8 years, I went into this dark night of the soul. I quit taking my sons to church and saying prayers with them at night. I just gave up on that notion. And that dark night of the soul, I think, was very important. I think a big, open-minded, true skepticism is important in this kind of journey of discovery. But remember that many who claim to be skeptics in the out there in the press, scientific skeptics, many times are pseudo-skeptics. They've already made up their mind. They don't care about empirical data. They could care less about rational argument. They just say NDEs are nonsense. Brain creates consciousness, so forget about it. Well, they can't explain shared death experiences, which occur very commonly, probably a 10th to a 20th as commonly as near-death experiences. And these are perfectly healthy people, and they're identical ingredients to an NDE. Mm-hmm. So And there's much more to that whole story of consciousness. That's what we go into in great detail in Living in a Mindful Universe. But anybody who thinks that NDEs and the lessons they teach are in conflict with modern science is willfully ignorant. They have not read the current science of consciousness work, like our book and like many others that I'm aware of, that really promote this idea of the fundamental nature of consciousness, that we're sharing one mind. And that consciousness is something revealed to us in these extremes of life, like near-death and death experiences. So I've gone full circle on this and come back to a very rich concept of spirituality. And it's one that honors a deity that is loving, compassionate, kind, merciful, as many great religions would promote. And I think we need to stop relying on, ancient texts as our main source of kind of belief and understanding, and take the rich, dynamic, living ground of modern spiritual experiences that fully promote that loving deity and this notion of oneness. It's time to really move forward and get out of the kind of dark ages of humanity of the last 5,000 years, even though I will admit that some of the major spiritual systems, both East and West, from thousands of years ago, certainly were hitting the nail on the head when it comes to oneness, to the origins of consciousness, what I would call today the position of either objective idealism, or even if you work the definitions of consciousness and God the right way, I would say you can fully support evolutionary panentheism, as a position that God force is within this whole reality as sentient beings. We have access to that God force. It shows us we're all in this together, need to take care of each other. And it evolves because free will is an essential component, which is injected by quantum physics itself into the equation of how reality unfolds. And to me, it's been a tremendous awakening, and I think the whole world will benefit as this kind of knowledge of the science of consciousness gets out to the world at large.
Mm-hmm. One thing that's always puzzled me, and this is coming from the psychotherapist in me, is the perspective on near-death experience. There tends to be more focus on what's creating it, whether it is a religious spiritual experience or whether it is just a neurochemical. And there's not enough attention, I believe, paid to the profound changes that people have. It's almost kind of like, well, it's a little side effect. And we don't really, I think, and I'm overgeneralizing, we as in, people who are interested in science, it's like we're too hung up on cause. And I think we could share a little bit of interest in the effect, as in, oh, it actually has made you a nicer, better person. What are your thoughts on that kind of focus?
Well, I think it's a beautiful focus, and you're right on the money. And this is where so much of what we say to support the notion of free will really kind of hits the road as very important. The kind of end goal, is there a purpose to all this? Is there a meaning to our existence? And I think those are very beautiful and profound questions that actually have some answers in this discussion. To me, I mean, I really look at the reason the universe exists as being the evolution of all of consciousness, of all sentience throughout the cosmos, of this cosmic mind in its process of growth and transformation and self-understanding. And just like that old saying, all politics is local, I would say all evolution of consciousness throughout the universe is nothing more than individual sentient beings coming to a deeper understanding of their own relationship with self, others, and the universe at large. And that's a beautiful way to look at it and to start deriving some meaningful results, because you don't have to have an NDE to benefit from the literature and the stories and the sharing of NDEs. I mean, Ken Ring, one of the founders of International Association of Near-Death Studies, wrote about this 30 years ago. When people hear about NDEs, know about them, it helps them in their own spiritual growth. And in many ways, I think the success of Proof of Heaven, I never expected it to be the giant, quick success that it was. It's been almost 2 years on the New York Times bestseller list, 42 weeks in the #1 position for nonfiction. And to me, that was a bit of surprise. I mean, I knew someday it would have great impact. I was just amazed how quickly it had impact. And a lot of that had to do with the fact that it resonated with others. Others who had had these experiences weren't sharing them. They might have even been frightened by them, thought they were going crazy. And then all of a sudden, this legitimized them. And that was really a main purpose of writing that book. And it's now been published in over 40 languages. So it really resonated with the world at large, but it was really my purpose to wake the world up to the power of NDEs writ large. This is not just about my little story. I'm just one little NDEer. It's important to the neuroscientific community because of the documented damage to my neocortex, which makes it crystal clear when you go through my medical records, that brain was not creating any dream or hallucination or confabulation, much less the most rich, memorable, detailed, and meaningful experience I've ever been through in my life, when all 8 lobes of my brain were demonstrably offline. But every NDE adds to the story and the understanding. And the more we share these stories, and with Proof of Heaven, I was hoping to take the lid off for the medical profession. And we hear from many physicians, nurses, healthcare workers of all stripes very favorably about Proof of Heaven, the map of heaven, and especially living in a mindful universe. That's where the science and the spirit really come together strongly. In this era, especially, you're probably aware, but there was a contest in the year 2020, and the question to answer was, what is the best scientific evidence for the survival of consciousness beyond permanent bodily death? The contest was run by Robert Bigelow, bigelowinstitute.org. He's an aerospace entrepreneur out in Las Vegas. And he received thousands of applicants. Only 204 groups were allowed to submit papers because they demonstrated that they had more than 5 years' experience investigating that question scientifically. And now for the public, you can all go read these papers for free at bigelowinstitute.org. And if you just start with a #1 paper by Jeffrey Mishlove, you will find an incredibly rich expose of someone who's paid a half a century of attention to this field to make it clear that the facts absolutely support the reality of the afterlife and survival of consciousness. And the other 28 papers just ice the cake tremendously. I can speak especially to some that I know and have read fully, like Pim Van Lommel's second place paper. And in that paper, he refers to our book, Living in Mindful Universe, as one of the 4 major sources that we're sharing one cosmic mind. The others are Larry Dossey's book, The One Mind. There's a beautiful paper by Bernardo Kastrup, a scientific paper on consciousness in the universe. And then that beautiful book by Steve Taylor, Spiritual Science. And all 4 of those sources are very powerful arguments for the reality of one cosmic mind that we are all sharing. And that's evidence and analysis in a modern scientific sense. So the game has totally changed with these Bigelow papers. And it's no longer a question of, is the afterlife real or not? Because the evidence is so overwhelming that you can't deny it. You might refuse to read them, or you might I would say, you might say, none of this can be true, it's all made up. But man, that's a giant stretch when you look at how carefully these papers have been put together. But the game has changed. And the more the public gets into the bigelowinstitute.org results and reads those essays, the more the world will change for the better.
Mm-hmm. The idea that that consciousness is outside of the mind, that consciousness is primary, is actually, as you're well aware, not a new idea, but it's something that has never, at least in our modern times, been taken seriously. But after a lot of research, a lot of having conversations like this, in many ways, it's the only thing that I'm aware of so far, because I'm still keeping an open mind in all different directions, but it's the only thing so far that makes the paranormal normal. Because
Right.
it's like it's the easiest, we talk about Occam's razor. It's actually the easiest way to explain all of this stuff, rather than, oh, he or she's lying, or it was just it's all just a specific in the brain, or they're mistaken, or this attitude that apparently educated people who have experiences like you are apparently dumb. It's like this kind of reactive thing. But to me, a primary consciousness is the easiest way to explain this stuff. I mean,
Right. It is. It's the most obvious answer. You're exactly right. And in our book, Living in a Mindful Universe, we go through an argument of consilience. Consilience is the notion that when you study something from very widely disparate directions, and if they all point to the same thing, then maybe that one thing is true. And for example, the consilience in this discussion concerns neuroscience, what's known as the hard problem of consciousness, first formally defined in the mid-1990s by David Chalmers. But basically, many have come to see it's the impossible problem of consciousness for the materialists. There's no way the materialists can ever come up with any kind of idea of how consciousness emerges from the physical brain. But then you've also got, say, philosophy of mind, and what is known as the binding problem, this apparent unity of consciousness within an individual, which, if all these different neuronal populations are participating in generating my consciousness, how is it so unified of everything I experience, remember, project into future? All of that is in this one tight package of kind of unified processing. How can that be if it's all these different neuronal populations doing their own individual jobs? And then you've got parapsychology, as you pointed out. And when people start to realize that the scientific evidence that supports things like telepathy, like Guillaume Playfair's book on twin telepathy is a beautiful example. Pre-sentiment, precognition, the experiments of Daryl Bem on precognition, or Dean Radin with pre-sentiment, that our autonomic nervous system, or that our brain can somehow know the future seconds, minutes in advance, if not longer. Things like that. Are we predicting the future or creating it? And then you've got things like remote viewing. One of the most proven kind of parapsychological phenomena. Ask Jessica Utts, the head of the American Statistical Association, in her presidential address in 2015. I mean, absolutely, no doubt, remote viewing is a very real phenomenon. Read all of Stefan Schwartz's work on archaeological digs through remote viewing. And then you've got out-of-body experiences, and then, of course, near-death experiences, deathbed visions, shared death experiences, and, of course, after-death communications, one of the strongest, most prevalent forms that Americans and people around the world know the reality of our soul's connections with loved ones, even after they've left the physical world, after-death communications. And then you get to that incredible gold mine of past life memories in children indicative of reincarnation, the writings of Ian Stevenson, Jim Tucker, more than 6 decades of work at University of Virginia. People can go to uvadops.org to learn a tremendous amount more about the strong evidence, more than 2,500 cases, past life memories in children, where the best explanation is of reincarnation. And many of those cases came long before the internet, when you had to do a lot more homework to establish the connection, but then there they are. Anyone discussing brain, mind, and consciousness in the current era, if they're not fully facile at discussing reincarnation cases and after-death communications and deathbed visions and NDE, shared death, et cetera, they're not even talking about consciousness. You can just dismiss whatever nonsense they're babbling about. We really need a much bigger kind of picture. And that's what we tried to paint in our book, Living in a Mindful Universe, is the consilience of all these lines of evidence. And then at the end of the day, you've got quantum physics. And of course, many quantum physicists will tell you that has nothing to do with consciousness. It shows how little they know about consciousness. And this is where, John Wheeler was definitely onto something, head of physics at Princeton in the mid-20th century, talking about the participatory anthropic principle. You couldn't just make it into one pure material universe, just following the laws of physics, chemistry, and biology, because in fact, you've got the psyche, the mental layer of the universe. And that's what we have access to. And I think that's the kind of model, as we explained in our book, that is now expanding tremendously. As you point out, this idea of that primordial mind and the brain is a filter. That goes back to the late 1800s. William James, head of psychology at Harvard, he was a huge proponent of this. of the idea that there was a primordial consciousness, the more, as he called it, the more that was necessary to explain all this. And then, of course, in France, you had Henri Bergson just a few decades later, the same kind of message. In the US, Aldous Huxley, who wrote, Doors of Perception, was very much into this notion of kind of the brain as a filter. And Frederick Meyer, back in the early part of the 20th century, one of the biggest proponents. His work is now being spotlighted tremendously by the group at UVA. Ed Kelly and others have talked about Frederick Meyer and the filter theory. So it's a beautiful idea that actually does a tremendous amount. Now, I'm interested in mechanism. As a neurosurgeon, neuroscientist, I want to know much more about how that happens. And I'm sure it has to do with something that we, at the end of the day, identify as various quantum states of neuronal ion channels in the brain. Mm-hmm. But ultimately, you keep defaulting to that materialist idea that the causality occurs within the physical universe, but that's where it's so important to acknowledge. We've never experienced anything other than our perceptions of a world. John Wheeler made that very clear. He agreed with George Berkeley, the Irish theologian who had lived 2 centuries earlier, who promoted idealism. Although Berkeley's idea was much more of, that notion that we're all just kind of within our own mind, and that's all there is to the universe. You can never prove the other minds. But this modern idea is much more refreshing because it's about a unification through the one mind, but that we all have our separate kind of angles to it. I liken it to facets on the diamond, all different ways of looking at that reality and sharing that reality. But in fact, we are truly sharing the dream of the one mind. And it's a beautifully unifying idea that I think is taking over the science of consciousness by storm.
Mm-hmm. The idea of a near-death experience and looking at people from the studies I've read before and after, no matter what injury to their brain or their body, it tends to be a pretty much permanent shift in either subtle aspects of personality or large aspects of personality. But the new, we'll just call it the new personalities, tend to be more alike, less stressed, more relaxed, seeing a bigger picture about things. So for me, trying to think logically and rationally about this, why would so many different, if the brain's being affected in different ways by different physical traumas, why would there be so much consecutive positive personality shifts in people who do near-death experiences? I'm sure that's something you've obviously thought deeply about.
Yeah, that's a beautiful way of putting it. And the interesting thing is even when you get into that category of what are called hellish NDEs or negative NDEs, which I think the literature would say are roughly 3 to 5%. Of course, there's a good argument that they are underreported even more than the positive NDEs because people are not going to want to share them so much. But I think there's still only, if you read Nancy Evans Bush has an excellent website on negative NDEs. And I remember reading on her website years ago about hospice workers in prison, one of the worst kind of maximum security prisons in the US, serving as hospice workers for fellow prisoners dying. And the interesting thing is they were having the same kind of very positive experiences at the end. Now, they were having to make amends in many cases for the crimes, the evils that they had committed, but they were doing it in that light of love that is very forgiving, as long as, as we learn in that process not to go down that pathway in a next lifetime. And if you read, for example, Christopher Kerr, Kerr, he's a hospice worker out of Buffalo. His new book came out in the last 2 or 3 years, Death is But a Dream. And all he does is deal with end-of-life cases. Now, he's not in a prison setting, but you find the very same themes. It's all about healing. It's all about, kind of making amends for the wrongs that we might have done to others, coming to honor the love and the compassion and mercy and acceptance that is so clear in the NDE realm. And that's very clear to those who are making that early part of the transition too. And And I think that's an important part of the lesson, is that this is an aspect of NDEs that's important to every one of us, no matter what our beliefs about such things, because it tells us a lot of what to expect when we make that transition. I would also point out in this discussion that the shared death experiences have a similar transformative effect. And those are in people with no brain malady at all. They don't have a shifting oxygen tension or CO2 level. They have the same kind of ingredients as an NDE. They may even witness the life review of their loved one who is making the transition before the bystander soul comes back to this world, but all very transformative. And likewise, as Ken Rain pointed out, we mentioned a few minutes ago, just knowing about this literature, seeing, hearing stories of the kind of healing that can happen, like the healing in my case from this meningitis that, according to the case report, would have a very, very low probability. In fact, almost infinitesimal of having a complete recovery. That's why they were so shocked. In fact, the medical peer reviewers of that journal challenged the authors of the case report on my medical records, said, how do you explain it? This case is absurd. How can someone this ill have a full recovery? And the three doctors who wrote the report said it was because he had an NDE. That gave him the ability to heal from this. We know of other cases. Anita Morjani would be an example, how she healed her lymphoma. Dr. Mary C. Neal, who healed from her over 30-minute warm water drowning. Cases like that with a profound NDE, they heal. Well, this should remind us, in medical science, we've used placebo effect for more than 6 decades as the gold standard by which to compare any new treatment modality. Ask Big Pharma if placebo effect is real. They hate it. Right out of the gate, there's about a 30% barrier they have to overcome, depending on the illness and the symptoms, et cetera. But even like curing cancer and advanced infections, people seem to be able to do with the power of belief and with profound spiritual journeys. So obviously, we need to learn a lot more as physicians, as healers of all stripes, in the power of mind, of spirit. Karen and I have, I've tried to quit. She keeps instructing me. It's not mind over matter, it's spirit over matter. And once you loosen up your definition of spirit, for me, spirituality has 2 ingredients. One is a sense of meaning and purpose. 2 is a sense of connectedness through mind with others. So you acknowledge power of prayer, kind of your ability to be empathetic with others and to help them come along into healing by sharing that love. So really, there are tremendous lessons about healing and coming into wholeness that I think apply not only to the individual and to families and to soul groups, but also ethnic groups, nations, and of course, the world at large. And it's not just about one mind among humans, because as Larry Dossey points out in his book, One Mind, it's very much involved in many animal systems, and you can argue in many plant systems. It's all about life. And that's where much of this kind of comes together in terms of promoting our healing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's interesting to me that in the realm study of consciousness for many years just kind of shifted over to the philosophical area, because it seemed like that medicine had figured it out, or so they thought. And now it's getting a little more loose. I was reminded when you mentioned William James, who got a lot of flack for studying consciousness, what he would refer to as mind. And he made the comment, well, the day psychology loses mind, it becomes mindless, which I think is a nice pun. And to some degree, I think as many ways he was quite apt. So when you're working with somebody, or having a conversation with a colleague, and what do you think their biggest barrier is, other than, if you take your personal story out, is it just that they have been so, I don't want to use this term, but it's the only thing I think of, programmed to automatically go reductionist due to training, or are there a lot of people kind of hiding behind that, but then when they're privately, they go, hey, Eben, I think you're on something. Keep going, but don't tell anyone I told you.
Well, believe me, a lot of scientists, engineers, physicists, physicians, nurses, chemists, what have you, all scientists of all stripes have reached out to us and thanked us for sharing this story, because they sensed there was much more going on. In fact, from my perspective and that of many scientists who study consciousness, this notion of brain creates consciousness, of physicalism or materialism in science died 80 years ago with the advent of quantum physics. And it's just that many of them have not read the memo yet. But quantum physics is really at the heart of this, the most proven field in the history of science. And one of the deepest and most profound lessons that is so shocking to modern science and physicists, et cetera, is that what it tells us, as John Wheeler was right onto with his participatory anthropic principle, is that this is all about perception. Nobody's ever known anything other than the inside of their own consciousness. And if you try and prove that there's a material world out there, an objective physical world independent of the observer, quantum physics absolutely proves you wrong at every turn. And they've struggled for almost a century on coming up with the right answer for the measurement paradox about the role of the mind intersecting with the experiment, et cetera. And I would say we're finally getting close to some answers. And for those who really pay attention to all that, we talk about it a lot in Living in a Mindful Universe, but I've moved a little beyond my position there to really adopting Carlo Rovelli's relational interpretation of the measurement paradox, which is really a very bare bones, no added stuff. But base that in Bernardo Kastrup's metaphysics. Go to bernardokastrup.com. You'll learn a lot more. He wrote a beautiful book a few years ago, The Idea of the World, which I highly recommend. And he's written several other books more recently. Just an incredible resource. He's one of the endorsers of Living in a Mindful Universe, as are many other scientists supporting the modern science of consciousness. But really, quantum physics is right at the heart of telling us it's all about this mental layer of the universe. That's where we have power. Beautiful essay entitled Mental Universe by a physicist from Johns Hopkins. It was written in the scientific journal Nature in 2005. It was by Richard Kahn Henry. Go check it out. It makes it clear as a bell in one page how modern quantum physics is directing us right towards the notion of a mental and spiritual universe. And all the materialists out there just give up. Forget about it, because this is now the way of moving forward. And that, of course, is where I would love to make a contribution, is to build that bridge. And that has to do with a deeper understanding of mechanism and pointing, we know causality from the mental layer is absolutely real. Placebo effect, spontaneous remission of cancers and illness, through adjustments of kind of emotions and relationship to spirituality, sense of purpose in life. These things can all help us to heal beyond any interventions of medical science. And then, of course, you have the miraculous healing in NDEs, like in my case, Anita Morjani, Mary C. Neal, et cetera. And all of this is just a beautiful example for the modern scientist, especially involved in healing and in psychology and in the power of beliefs, thoughts, and attitudes, to really kind of run with it. Because I think this is where the free will of sentient beings truly manifest, is through the amount of healing that we can do. And right now, our world is also in need of tremendous healing. Very polarized, new threats of war. I mean, I thought we gave all that up back in 1945, at least this major European continental war. What in the world is Putin thinking? So it really is time to grow up and mature. We call ourselves Homo sapiens. Sapiens means wise. From my point of view, our status quo and the current position of this egocentric, false sense of separation and materialist thinking is what dooms us and our planet. Corporate greed, fossil fuel addiction, climate change, every bit of it is wrapped up with that materialist science and a false sense of separation. Quantum-informed consciousness studies emphasize the oneness we share, that we're all in this together, and we should be stewards of this planet to take care of it for future generations. And when you read the reincarnation literature, if you're selfish and egocentric, at least you can realize that it's an aspect of you that's going to be reincarnated to suffer from what we do today to wreck our climate further. So if you need that selfish prod of studying the literature on reincarnation, so be it. The reality is we all need to take up the banner and take a greater responsibility for ourselves and others to bring love, kindness, compassion, mercy, take care of the least, the last, and the lost. Realize the golden rule is truly written into the fabric of the universe, and let's grow up.
Well, Dr. Eben Alexander, a profound and heartfelt conversation today, and I am so delighted to connect with you and to share this dialogue. Before we say goodbye, real quickly, can you tell viewers the best place to find your work?
Yes, absolutely. Go to Eben, that's EBEN Alexander.com. You'll find a lot there, a recommended reading list, more than 100 resources on all this, all categorized, many with hot links directly to the papers. The blog postings are very informative. I'm going to get back into those soon, I hope. I've been a little busy with other things. Anyway, and links to all the books, including endorsements, etc. EbenAlexander.com. Also, those who want to follow my lead of meditation, I use sacred acoustics. I do it an hour or two a day. Been doing that more than a decade now. It's contributed tremendously to my reuniting with all the aspects of my NDE and also promoting healing in self and others. Sacredacoustics.com is the resource for that. And also during the pandemic, Karen had a brilliant idea. Since we weren't traveling and meeting our wonderful friends at conferences and presentations, to interview them. So every 2 weeks, we would do an interview. And those are all posted for free online. People can go to unitedinhopeandhealing.com and leave your first name and an email address, and you can get right into all of that process. Those are all great ways to keep in touch with me and a lot of the work that I do.
Excellent. Well, again, thank you so much for sharing your knowledge and most importantly for sharing your experience. I really, truly appreciate it.
Well, thank you, Paul. It's been a joy speaking with you, and thank you for getting this out to the world.
All right.